I can tell you what sitting by his bed was like for that 2 weeks, while he hallucinated and couldn't remember my name and wouldn't eat or drink and urinated on himself and smelled to high heaven. I can tell you what it was like to ask him over and over, please make a good decision for yourself. Please make a good decision. Please make a good decision. Get in my car and let me take you to the hospital. It doesn't work, and it's designed not to work. It's designed to fail, and it does. And your child ends up in the gutter or the morgue because we've designed a mental health system that only treats people who are already healthy in some capacity and literally has zero treatment for someone who's too sick to get there by themselves.
Hi, my name is Dr. Steven Seeger. I've been a psychiatrist for 25 years. I'm also a writer. I've written several books about the plight of the seriously mentally ill in our country. Most recently, in Behind the Gates of Gomorrah, A Year with the Criminally Insane. I'm here to talk about a national tragedy, something that few people understand, and even fewer people have any idea how to fix. What I'm here to talk about is the epic disaster that is our national mental health care system. A system so broken, so utterly dysfunctional, that you will hear a family tell of being grateful their seriously mentally ill brother died of lung cancer instead of what usually happens. People who suffer from mental illness can be shot, lit on fire, starved to death in the gutter, or simply rot away in our prisons and jails. We've all seen too much of this on the news or on the sidewalks and in the alleys of our own cities. But know that things weren't always like this. Things used to be different. They used to be very different. In 1959 in America, there were 350,000 persons with serious mental illness, mainly schizophrenia, severe depression, and bipolar disorder, all getting treatment in hospitals. There were no psychotic people in our jails or prisons. There was no such thing as a mentally ill person living on the streets. The phrase homeless mentally ill didn't exist. Police weren't involved with mentally ill persons at all. Now move ahead 50 years to the 21st century. Today as we speak, there are 1.3 million mentally sick Americans in prison and jail, often in solitary confinement. Many others have died, their lifespan being on average 20 years shorter than before. And now 350,000 seriously mentally ill persons rot away on our urban streets. If you tried, you couldn't make a worse mental health system than the one we have today.
Families are considered the F word in mental health. Families aren't respected, and we're treated like it's our fault. The system is seriously broken. It's fragmented. It ignores families like mine. It treats us like we're enemies, and what we are really is we're partners in care. And when we have people that are there's too much emphasis on protecting people's rights, and I am a strong advocate of civil liberties. But when you have people dying, because they can't get the care they need to live and survive, and you have no access to beds, and you have no access to therapy, and you have no support system, no community system is set up.
How did things get so fouled up? It all began with a book. In 1948, Albert Deutsch, a columnist for the New York Post newspaper, wrote a book entitled Shame of the States. Shame of the States detailed the poor conditions endured by psychiatric patients during the 1940s at a series of American state mental hospitals, or asylums as they were called then. Owing to years of neglect and understaffing after the Depression and 2 world wars, American state mental hospitals were overcrowded, they were unsanitary, Treatment was shoddy. Deutsch described the treatment in these hospitals as euthanasia by neglect. He said,
"We are not like the Nazis. We do not kill off our insane people coldly, as a matter of official state policy. We do not do it deliberately. We do it by neglect."
if Deutsch were living today, he might have added, in 21st century America, we too now deliberately kill off our insane people. We still use neglect, but we have it down to a science. It has now become official state policy.
Well, Paul was lucky because even though he spent 20 years in a state hospital, 9 years cycling in and out of the ER, getting picked up by police, going through periods without food, being preyed upon by drug dealers, foot fungus, lung cancer. He was not shot by police. He was never homeless. He was never arrested. He was never in prison. He never killed anyone. He was never assaulted. And that seems to be the norm today.
Paul didn't think he was mentally ill most of the time. I think sometimes he would admit, I mean, he had lived for 20 years in a mental hospital. Obviously, he knew something was not quite right. But then he would say, I really was there working undercover for the FBI to investigate mental hospitals. So, but when I got into thinking about writing a book, I didn't want to write a book about the statistics of how many people are in mental hospitals and how many people need care and all that stuff. I wanted people to learn what it's like to be in a family that falls apart. Just everything fell apart.
I would make it be that that people had a right to receive health care, not a right to refuse it. And when people aren't able to know that they're mentally ill, there needs to be a lot of care and security about how those decisions get made so that they're not made irresponsibly. But we have to have the courage to make those decisions. It takes a lot of courage to say, my brother needs that medicine, even though he doesn't want it. I want you to give it to him. And we as a society have to have the guts to do that.
Responding to the call of Deutsch and others, in 1955, President Eisenhower appointed a special blue ribbon congressional commission to investigate the conditions at American state mental hospitals. The commission was composed of psychiatrists, attorneys, lawmakers, and mental health advocates. The commission was called the Joint Commission on Mental Illness and Mental Health, or simply the Joint Commission for short. In 1961, the Joint Commission issued a final report, which called for a sweeping reform of our national mental health system. Congress acted quickly, and in 1963, President Kennedy signed these reforms into law. The legislation based on the Joint Commission findings was called the Community Mental Health Centers Act. The Community Mental Health Centers Act called for the creation of a national network of community mental health centers, which would, the Joint Commission hoped, totally replace the care provided by all the nation's state mental hospitals. The community mental health centers would provide comprehensive mental health services for the seriously mentally ill in that person's hometown. This in turn would lead to earlier, more effective intervention into the mental disease process, prevention of mental illness altogether, and the need for state hospitals at all. At the time, these unsupported conclusions were universally applauded by Democrats, Republicans, psychiatrists, lawyers, and the general public. Everyone thought this was a great idea. The problem was this: there wasn't a single bit of scientific evidence or scientific data that such a sweeping community approach would actually work. And so, based on slick salesmanship, startling naivete, and a heavy dose of wishful thinking, but no scientific evidence or data. The community mental health center movement was rolled out nationwide. The state hospitals were emptied, many closed for good, and 500,000 chronically psychotic people were sent to the communities that had sent them to the state hospital in the first place. In 1989, the New York Times said of the community mental health center movement that in retrospect, it was widely regarded as a major failure. And when asked, even the people who planned and implemented the community mental health center movement in the 1960s and the deinstitutionalization or release of the state mental patients that followed now sadly admit that right from the very start, they knew the whole scheme of community care wouldn't work. Dr. Robert H. Felix, then director of the National Institute of Mental Health and a major architect of the Community Mental Health Center movement, now says, many of those patients who left the state hospitals never should have done so. We overreacted. The results were not what we intended. Perhaps we didn't ask the questions that should have been asked. Dr. M. Brewster Smith, a University of California psychologist and vice chairman of the Congressional Joint Commission, now states, extravagant claims were made for the benefits of shifting from state hospitals to community clinics. Local mental health centers were going to be the greatest thing going, but no one wanted to think it through. Dr. Bertram S. Brown, psychiatrist and federal official, a person instrumental in shaping the Community Mental Health Center Act, now says, we knew there weren't enough resources in the community to do the job. We knew people would be in the streets. Those who proposed the foolish Community Mental Health Center movement, now called deinstitutionalization, knew it wouldn't work, but they did it anyway.
Families have tried to get these people treatment, and the system has made it so difficult in the name of protecting these people's right to choose, and they have an illness that prevents them from choosing, that they end up becoming more and more ill, and the families are helpless.
The Community Mental Health Center disaster required more than just federal legislation to exact its full carnage. It needed extra fuel to propel its ruinous course down through the decades. That fuel was supplied by the American court system. Beginning in the early 1970s, an army of lawyers, known as the Mental Health Bar, continued the assault on the mental health system. The attorneys of the Mental Health Bar are committed to the elimination of all involuntary psychiatric hospitalization, regardless of medical need. What does this mean? It means that your sick child, incapable of making a clear decision for themselves, is denied any treatment at all.
Well, there's 100% of the population can have their mental health improved. 18% have something that's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. There's 4% who have a serious and persistent mental illness, meaning it affects in a profound way their ability to function. And about half of those go untreated. The leading reasons are that the mental health system doesn't want to serve the most seriously ill. It is much more interested in serving the higher functioning. So if two people walk up to a program, one needs marriage counseling and the other's homeless, psychotic, and has schizophrenia, they're going to admit the person who wants marriage counseling and say they're not set up for the high needs patient.
Numerous lawsuits were filed, which resulted in a collection of really unfortunate state court decisions and ultimately very unfortunate U.S. Supreme Court rulings, the sum of which resulted in the denial of treatment to our most seriously mentally ill sick persons. 3 cases stand out. First, a Florida court said that in order to get treatment, a mentally sick person had to be more than sick, they had to also be dangerous. In 1956, at the request of his parents, 34-year-old Kenneth Donaldson was admitted to Florida's Chattahoochee State Mental Hospital. Donaldson had become paranoid, believing his food was poisoned. Donaldson lacked insight, something called anosognosia, or a denial of illness. It's a common problem for those who suffer with a serious mental illness. Donaldson consistently said he wasn't sick, that he never had been sick. And because he wasn't sick, he refused all the treatment they offered him. After 15 years in the hospital, Donaldson filed suit. He hired an attorney and filed a lawsuit against the hospital and its staff, claiming that by admitting him against his will, they'd violated his constitutional rights. In 1975, his case reached the U.S. Supreme Court. In their Donaldson decision, the U.S. Supreme Court said that involuntary psychiatric hospitalization was, and I quote, akin to fencing in anyone who caused public unease, citing the examples of those who are physically unattractive or socially eccentric. Unfortunately, for people suffering from mental illness, the court trivialized the severity of serious brain disease by their inappropriate and childish fencing in analogy. The court implied that mentally ill persons were not hospitalized for needed medical treatment, but for silly, trivial reasons. The Donaldson court concluded that only a finding of dangerousness could warrant involuntary confinement. The social catastrophe of the homeless mentally ill can be directly traced to the Donaldson decision. The legacy of human misery engendered by the Supreme Court's callous ignorance is beyond calculation. In a second case, the court did much better. They decided that, dangerous or not, the mentally ill deserved adequate, modern medical treatment. But unfortunately, what resulted was no treatment at all. In 1970, the state of Alabama lowered its cigarette tax rate, the revenue from which had been used to fund the Bryce State Mental Asylum in Tuscaloosa. This revenue loss resulted in many hospital employees losing their jobs, including some staff psychologists who then sued for reinstatement, claiming that owing to the layoffs, patient care at Bryce State Hospital had been severely disrupted. To bolster this claim, a patient was added to the list of plaintiffs. His name was Ricky Wyatt. Wyatt was the nephew of one of the psychologists. The suit was filed against the director of the Alabama Department of Mental Health, Stonewall Stickney. The case, Wyatt v. Stickney, was eventually heard by civil rights era hero, federal judge Frank Johnson. In 1971, Johnson ruled in favor of the aggrieved psychologist and Ricky Wyatt, famously stating that
there can be no legal or moral justification for the state of Alabama failing to afford treatment, and adequate treatment from a medical standpoint.
Johnson then actually defined what adequate medical treatment should look like. He set down strict standards and established firm medical guidelines. The Alabama Standard ensured that state mental hospitals were to be clean and safe environments. They were to have good doctor-patient ratios. There were to be enough social workers and enough nurses. Johnson addressed all the relevant concerns and laid out a plan. Judge Johnson in Wyatt v. Stickney established a right to the treatment for the involuntarily committed mentally ill person. Question: was Wyatt v. Stickney used as a standard by other states? Answer: yes, it was. Question: did Wyatt v. Stickney result in improved health care for involuntarily hospitalized psychiatric patients as Judge Johnson had ordered? Answer: no, it did not. Judge Johnson's Wyatt v. Stickney ruling was indeed used as a national standard, but not in the way Johnson intended. The state of Alabama agreed that all the guidelines Johnson put forth were laudable, but state legislators quickly decided that implementing the needed humane changes would simply be too expensive. So the Alabama state legislators' thinking went, we agree with Johnson, but since we can't comply with the federal order because it's too expensive, we'll just close the hospital instead. And what happened to the 5,500 patients housed at Bryce State Hospital in Tuscaloosa, Alabama? Those who were supposed to be the recipients of the clean, humane, up-to-date medical care ordered by Judge Johnson? You can guess this one. They were sent back to the communities that had sent them to the state hospital in the first place. Teased by the prospect of humane medical care, the mentally sick of Alabama were quickly relegated to the gutter and dumpsters. The Stickney decision was the justification used for most other states to close their psychiatric hospitals. White v. Stickney proved to be the ultimate example of cruel bait and switch, and all 50 states soon followed Alabama's shameful example. And finally, in our third case, a Wisconsin court said that all mentally sick persons were criminals. In October 1971, Alberta Lessard of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was hospitalized after a reported suicide attempt. This was a routine case until Lessard hired Milwaukee Legal Services, a federally funded law firm. Lawyers from the Milwaukee group challenged Ms. Lessard's commitments on grounds that the Wisconsin state commitment laws were too vague. In its final decision, the Wisconsin Supreme Court agreed with Lessard. They said that she hadn't been granted her constitutionally guaranteed due process rights. They said, and I quote, "For commitment proceedings to proceed, the mentally ill person should be afforded all the protections of any criminal suspect." Because of Lessard, mentally sick persons were indeed afforded all the protections of any criminal suspect, but then they also began to be treated like, as the court ruling specifically stated, any other criminal suspect. Thus began the criminalization of the mentally ill. The focus was now permanently removed from medical treatment provided by doctors and hospitals and squarely placed on the shoulders of the local police, courts, and jails. Mentally sick persons were no longer viewed as someone in need of medical treatment. They were now criminals in need of lawyers, due process, and jail cells. Because of Lessard, the psychiatric process had now become adversarial, cops and robbers, rather than cooperative, doctors, patients, and families.
He had a happy childhood. He was good-natured. He slept well. He ate well. He was hardly ever sick. We lived on a farm. He played outside. He loved animals. Many people have asked me if I knew something was wrong with him early or if there were early signs, and there weren't. If anything, he was just a happy bundle of joy for our house. Excuse me. One of the first things that happened when he got sick was he complained to me that if he was on the baseball field, people were staring at him. And he couldn't stand to be stared at that way when he was trying to play ball. Of course, later, that remark made sense.
And he was experiencing a feeling of paranoia, and he thought that some drug dealer was chasing him. He ran to his apartment, and the first thing he did was call the police and asked them to come, and he said there's somebody chasing him. I think they told him with a gun. I don't know. But that was his state of mind. And the police came to his apartment. I had a full-time caretaker who lived next door, and she was standing on the steps. The police mistakenly thought that she was the perpetrator, threw her to the ground and handcuffed her. And I had a second person who was assisting her. They did the same thing to him. She happened to be of color, and he was Latino. I don't say that has anything to do with it, and they went upstairs to his apartment and figured out that they had made a mistake and didn't want to have anything to do with him and left, and of course released the caregivers, but what a mess. Then he called me and said that somebody was chasing him and he wanted to go back to jail. Jail is not the Hilton Hotel. You don't check in and check out at will. I said, but call your attorney and tell him the circumstances that you're experiencing, and I'll call him in half an hour. This is on a Saturday. You know, I don't know where I was, but I was not in New York City. And I'm trying to coordinate, get a hold of the caregiver and see what the heck's going on. And the next thing he does, instead of calling his lawyer, he decides to call the fire department. He takes some garbage from his waste paper basket, puts it on his stove, makes a little fire, and then calls the fire department and says there's a fire in his apartment. Now, his reasoning was, oh, they're going to come and protect him against this person who's pursuing him. Waited in the apartment. Fire department came. They put out the fire. And then they arrested him for arson. When I got to court and I entered into a dialogue with the district attorney, the person on the highest level that was in charge of his case, he agreed that these were not normal circumstances. And he said if I could bring him a lockdown mental health facility, that he would consider referring him there. Well, I didn't realize that he'd send me on a fool's errand, because there is no such thing as a lockdown mental health facility.
The ancient Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians understood mental illness as a brain disease. Their treatments included boat rides down the Nile, stays at healing temples, and an early form of electrical head stimulation involving eels. These ancient cultures treated the mentally ill with sympathy and kindness. In biblical times, the mentally ill were thought to be possessed by demons in need of exorcism. During the Middle Ages, the mentally ill weren't thought to be possessed by demons, they were thought to be demons, and these demons needed killing. Those who didn't die from torture were burned alive. Hundreds of thousands of brain-sick people were murdered in this grisly fashion. In the 18th century, during the so-called Enlightenment, when reason and intellect were most prized, the mentally sick were thought to have lost their human capacity for reason. They were believed to be subhuman, akin to dumb animals. It was thought that mentally sick persons were insensitive to hot and cold, and some said they didn't feel pain. Beatings, starvation, physical and sexual abuse were commonly administered as treatment. The brain diseased were warehoused in early excuses for hospitals, where they were systematically neglected and brutalized. In England and America, to pay for a patient's care, tickets were sold to the public. Families were encouraged to roam the hospital corridors and openly mock, ridicule, or harass the sick unfortunates. In 1841, a Boston schoolteacher, Dorothea Dix, volunteered to teach a Sunday school class at the East Cambridge Jail. Dix was horrified by what she saw. She found the conditions for the mentally sick inhumane and intolerable. Fortunately for America's mentally ill, in addition to being appalled, Dix was moved to action. Dorothea Dix dedicated the rest of her life to improving conditions for the country's mentally ill. Dorothea Dix addressed the legislatures in every state. She advocated for the construction of clean, modern mental hospitals, and hearkening back to ancient Greece and Rome, she called for the delivery of compassionate, humane care. Addressing the Massachusetts legislature, Dix said,
I come to present the strong claims of suffering humanity. I come to place before the legislature of Massachusetts the condition of the miserable, the desolate, the outcast. I come as an advocate of helpless, forgotten, insane men and women, of beings sunk to a condition from which the unconcerned world would start with real horror.
In contrast to our current legislators, the 19th century lawmakers actually listened to Dorothea Dix's tales of horror and abuse and were moved to act. Dorothea Dix was single-handedly responsible for the construction of 30 new state mental hospitals called asylums. An asylum was used in the best sense of the word. An asylum was an institution offering shelter and support. Placed in peaceful settings where the chance of recovery seemed to be the greatest, these new asylums quickly took over the care for America's mentally ill. Using the principles of compassionate, humane care amid clean, healthy surroundings, the goal of the new asylums was to actually cure those who suffered from chronic mental illness. But as the years wore on, despite everyone's hopes, the seriously mentally ill just didn't get any better in their new asylums. they remained as sick as ever. The turmoil of the 20th century quickly diverted attention away from the seriously mentally ill. Enthusiasm waned, funding dried up, and hospital conditions deteriorated. Then shame on the states appeared, followed quickly by the twin disasters of the community care movement and deinstitutionalization. So today, in the 21st century, we have, for those who suffer with serious mental illness, come full circle back to the dismal depths of the 19th century. We house our severely mentally ill parents, wives, husbands, and children, primarily in our nation's jails and prisons, often as in previous centuries in solitary confinement.
They aren't, we closed all the mental health hospitals. And of course, if we go to the jails, what a surprise. We have about 1 million mentally ill people in jail. We came to a political decision, essentially to, we released these people out into the streets for a while, and then when they didn't make it, which was predictable, we put them in jail because we decided we didn't want to have mental hospitals. We've dumped this problem on the police, and now we blame them for their difficulties in trying to deal with it. I discovered that not only was our system broken and completely out of control, but when you spoke to even the high officials involved in criminal justice, they all agreed. They weren't protecting anything. They said, no, this is the system is broken, and we have to change it. And how many times do you have to read the parents say, oh, well, you know, we knew that he was dangerous, and we tried to find a place, and we brought him to the emergency room, and they released him after 24 hours and said he was fine. Every day we read about shootings in schools. I mean, what's the matter with us?
The people interested in improving care for the most seriously ill tend to be Republicans. My fellow Democrats don't recognize unpleasant truths. Those unpleasant truths are not everyone recovers. Sometimes hospitals are needed. Involuntary commitment is better than incarceration. And people with untreated serious mental illness are, as a group, more violent than others. They think throwing money at mental health helps the seriously mentally ill, and it doesn't. Police have become the first responders for persons with mental illness. The police step in when one condition is met. The mental health system failed. Then police go in. So there are people who want to train police better. That's useful, but I would argue we should have the police train the mental health system to stop ignoring the most seriously ill.
Well, Zach was always well behaved. He was a people and a parent pleaser. Really didn't like negative attention at all. And suddenly one evening he was out with his friends and called me and said that he couldn't come home. He would like to come home, but he couldn't. And he would let me know pretty soon if he was able to come home or not, which is just a bizarre conversation to have with a teenager. He called 3 more times to say almost the exact same thing. Then I got very worried and I said, where are you? I'm coming to get you right now. He had our family car. Well, the car was totaled. He was standing next to a totaled car. He was shaking head to toe. He seemed a little disoriented. And when I got out of the car and ran to him, he was just saying, Mom, Mom, in a weird way over and over. And then he said, thank God something needs to stop me. Then after that, one incident quickly followed the next. I had a trip planned to go to San Francisco, part business, part to see a friend. I was concerned about some of his behavior, and he was 17. I hired a babysitter so I could be gone for the 2 or 3 days. I got on the plane, I landed in San Francisco, I turned on my phone, and I had probably 15 text messages from Zach, and none of them made sense. just from memory. One said, "Voices are coming out of my phone. I'm burning my phone on the stove right now." So I began calling him. He answered the phone and hung up, answered the phone and hung up, answered the phone and hung up. I really started getting frantic, and I was still in the San Francisco airport. Then a few more text messages came. "Voices are coming out of the smoke detectors in the house. I might have to burn the house down." I got here the next morning. He was locked in the basement. A few days after that, he walked halfway across the floor, stopped, and postured. But when you have to vacuum around your own son standing in the middle of the floor while he stares at an imaginary spot on the wall, you know you have a problem.
Regarding the treatment of serious mental illness, it seems we have two choices. We either want things to remain the same or we want something different. First, if we want things to remain the same, no problem. There are many people, bureaucrats, politicians, and attorneys, who support this viewpoint. The Federal Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, the funnel for all federal money into national mental health services, firmly supports the current situation of abuse and neglect. SAMHSA has an annual budget of $3.6 billion. Since its inception in 1992, SAMHSA has spent approximately $80 billion on the nation's mental health care system. And for all that time and money, what has SAMHSA accomplished? First, SAMHSA has overseen the explosion of homelessness among mentally sick Americans. Second, they have silently stood watch over the spectacular rise in the incarceration rates of Americans with serious mental illness, often in private, for-profit prisons, where many seriously psychotic Americans often are held in solitary confinement. Third, SAMHSA has watched as thousands of psychiatric hospital beds have been closed, often entire hospitals. If federal SAMHSA funds don't help those with serious mental illness, where does SAMHSA spend all that money? Firmly supporting only voluntary treatment, SAMHSA funds many non-scientific, even bizarre schemes. They recommend, for instance, quote, drinking more smoothies. They suggest that each local mental health agency appoint a, quote, commissioner of laughter. SAMHSA recently funded a ridiculous form of therapy that involves tapping a patient with your fingertips to release blocked mental energy. SAMHSA has been called the worst-run federal agency in America. Many, including me, call SAMHSA an elaborate scam. Almost all advocates for serious mental health reform call for SAMHSA to be dismantled. For SAMHSA and their supporters, the answer to the collapse of our nation's mental health system is to blindly keep pumping more and more money into it, to keep shoveling billions and billions down into the apparently bottomless pit, with no results whatsoever for the seriously mentally ill. We've tried the voluntary treatment approach for 50 years. Look around. It doesn't work. Enough is enough. What would a good, comprehensive national mental health program actually look like? An effective program already exists, and is probably in the last place you would think to look. The best treatment system for those with serious mental illness exists at California's 5 remaining state forensic mental hospitals, the very institutions so demonized during deinstitutionalization. The medical care given in them has been reformed and modernized, and now stands without peer. Even more amazing is the coordinated, comprehensive outpatient treatment program with which these state hospitals are integrated. CONREP is an involuntary, court-ordered program that harmonizes inpatient hospital treatment and comprehensive outpatient services. It is well liked by patients and their families. Here's the basic outline. Once hospitalized, a person suffering from an active psychotic mental illness is provided with an array of treatments. They get medication, either voluntarily or involuntarily, to treat their illness symptoms. They receive intensive therapy, individual and group. They receive a complete social service evaluation and a comprehensive drug and alcohol treatment program. They get complete medical and dental care. Patients have access to a full range of recreation therapy services, sports leagues, running, walking, karaoke, music, library, and cooking groups. Once a patient is well and discharged from the hospital, outpatient CONREP workers then assist with supported housing, supported employment. They closely monitor a person's compliance with their medication regimen and all doctors and therapist appointments. If a CONREP program enrollee has a flare-up of their psychotic symptoms, the person will be intensively reevaluated and can be re-hospitalized if needed. At every step along the way, the CONREP program actively supports and encourages family involvement. Family members are often a mentally ill person's biggest asset as they progress along the road to recovery. So what stands in the way of such a successful program such as CONREP from being instituted nationwide? Some say it's too expensive. Others say involuntary treatment is wrong. Fair enough. But isn't incarceration of the mentally ill more wrong? Or the horror of the homeless mentally ill? Or the seemingly never-ending stream of shootings perpetrated by the untreated mentally ill? It's actually cheaper in the long run to treat the brain diseased than to jail them. If you want less violence, fewer mass shootings, then treat the mentally ill. If you want to get the seriously mentally ill Americans out of jail, out of solitary confinement, out of prisons. If you want doctors, therapists, and nurses treating the mentally ill rather than policemen, sheriffs, and jailers, then treat the mentally ill before they get into prison, before they commit the crimes, before the tragedy. This is the point in the movie that's called the call to action. This is where we're supposed to sum up and give a plan for what to do. But before I do that, I want to say personally how grateful I am to all the people who took part in this movie, the people who told their stories. I know it was painful to relive those moments. I can't imagine the pain you've been through. My and my crew, we truly appreciate your time and what you've given to us. Thank you very much. We also want to thank all the people who took the time to back our movie financially and all of you who took the time to watch it. The people who were in the movie, you and I, and we all now know that this system is bad and needs to be fixed. But I'll tell you for sure, the fix will not come from the top down. It won't come from Congress. It won't come from SAMHSA. It won't come from the Federal Mental Health Agency. It won't come from any of that. They're too fouled up. They're never going to get their act together. It's going to come state by state. It's going to come from the local level, from yours and my level, from all of us gathering together, cornering a legislator, cornering two legislators, getting a committee together, showing this movie, growing a grassroots constituency, getting a bill to rise up. And I think it can happen in any state. In fact, my prediction is it'll be a state that you're surprised. It might be Utah, Indiana, New Hampshire, but it'll happen somewhere. And once it happens and people see that this program works, every state will fall in line and things will change. And no matter how hard it is or how long it takes, I want you to be assured this does work and we can do it.
In 2012, my son went off his medicine, became so psychotic that he thought his ankles were pulverized, his back was broken, and he had a brain tumor. He went to bed and said he would get up when he healed. 2 weeks later, I had the police carry him down the stairs and put him in a squad car and take him to a hospital. And I only got that intervention by going to a courthouse and saying terrible things about my own son just to get him removed and to care, because he thought he was fine and he was refusing treatment. I called crisis intervention 3 times in 1 week. Crisis intervention is the community health care promise, right, of how we'll get you some emergency care. Crisis intervention wouldn't come because he had a choice and he said no. So the voluntary system is set up only for people who are well enough to say, I really need help. That voluntary system means that he can't volunteer, and he doesn't, and he gets no care. The system literally is set up to prevent you from getting any care. Crisis intervention called me at the end of the week with a survey and wanted to know how well their services worked on my mentally ill child. And I said, you're buffoons, you're idiots, you shouldn't have a job, and don't call this family again. And so the child laid in his bed for another week, not eating and drinking, wildly hallucinating, smelling to high heaven, covered in filth, lips cracked, dandruff in his eyelashes, until I went to the courthouse and said, my son won't eat or drink, and I'm afraid he's going to die in his bed. And then I got some help. In another brain disorder, I would be negligent for allowing that child to waste away in his bed and refuse food and drink for 2 weeks. I'd be negligent under the law. In mental health, I'm encouraging a decision to come to care. It's not even sensical. It defies logic, the way we've set this up, so that you can only get medical attention if you are well enough to get medical attention. And no other illness is treated this way, and in fact, no other brain illness is treated this way. We have to stop talking about mental health and start talking about mental illness. We have to stop over-treating mental health and start treating the undertreated and non-treated mental illness. I can tell you what sitting by his bed was like for that 2 weeks, while he hallucinated and couldn't remember my name and wouldn't eat or drink and urinated on himself and smelled to high heaven. I can tell you what it was like to ask him over and over, please make a good decision for yourself. Please make a good decision. Please make a good decision. Get in my car and let me take you to the hospital. It doesn't work, and it's designed not to work. It's designed to fail, and it does. And your child ends up in the gutter or the morgue.